Accreditation, WOSA 2018. The title of the session is Achieving Excellence Through Learning Outcomes. Although any session post-lunch is considered to be a very heavy session, but if we have such eminent personalities as speakers for the session, I'm sure that it won't be a heavy session, it would be one of the best sessions which you would have ever witnessed. May I take the pleasure of inviting Professor A.H. Kalro, Professor Bhaskar, Bharat Bhaskar, and Professor Bhimram Maitri. I request you all to please
institutions, including Entrepreneurship Development Institutes of India, Ahmedabad, Indian Institute of Management Technology, Ghaziabad, TKM Institute of Management Studies, Kerala, ICFI University, Himachal. He is a member of Academic Advisory Council, National Board of Accreditation. Sir, we welcome you and look forward for your enriching thoughts and experiences. I invite you for your sessions.
Thank you very much. I must thank the NBA for providing me this privilege to have this opportunity to meet old friends and also share some thoughts with you on this subject of achieving excellence through learning outcomes. Now, at the very outset, I would like to clarify that contrary to the kind of things we discussed about learning outcomes in the morning, where we did talk quite a bit about school education at the primary, secondary, and higher secondary levels, what I have to say is essentially focused on higher education, and within higher education, on higher technical education. Secondly, most of the things that I have to talk about today or have an opinion to express about are largely in the Indian context, because that's where I have had the opportunity to work for decades. At the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, at the Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode, at Ahmedabad University, and other institutions. Now, if we had to look at the past in India, we can recall with pride that India has been the cradle of modern civilization, and it has been known for its phenomenal contributions to science, mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, political science, economics, administration, and many, many other fields. And indeed, a lot of this was possible because India was the home of the first universities in the world. And these universities were centers of scholarship, and they attracted scholars and thinkers from all over the world. Unfortunately, they were destroyed by repeated invasions, and also people who thought very differently about what education was meant to be. And at the very outset, I want to quote two persons who must be known to all of you, whose basic thoughts on education have been a guiding philosophy for most of us in this part of the world. First of all, Swami Vivekananda had said that we want that education by which character is formed, strength of mind is increased, the intellect is expanded, and by which one can stand on one's own feet. Now you can see the wonderful manner and how intricately outcomes have been integrated into this definition of education, and beyond outcomes also. Beyond outcomes is what I would like to emphasize. The second is a definition of education, a philosophy provided by Paulo Freire, the Brazilian philosopher and educationist. And he said that education is not merely possessing knowledge and data. It is building in the learner, see the change to the learner, an awareness of the situation in which he lives and of his own potential limitations in dealing with this situation. It is not the content alone that is important, but the method as well. Beyond outcomes, the method as well, for it implies that the learner is fully involved and active in the learning process. In a sense, both these definitions or concepts of education will guide what I have to say today. And in fact, both these statements that I refer to have been my guiding principles when I have thought of education in the institutions where I had a role to play in their formative years. If you trace the historical concerns, universities were centers of scholarship, because after the well-known first universities in India got destroyed, the center moved to Europe, and I include UK as part of that Europe. Universities were centers of scholarship, and their main task was largely to protect academic freedom. But unfortunately, the 2-3 best universities at that time, the University of Paris, Oxford, more than 800 years old, Cambridge, more than 800 years old, the University of Paris, also that old and more, had severe problems about the manner in which they delivered education and what they delivered. The British model was to emphasize liberal education, and the British model was to emphasize self-regulation, whether it was Oxford or Cambridge. But unfortunately, the French model was not based on the same principles, because the church at Rome had a major role to play on what would be taught at the University of Paris and how it would be taught. The Pope at Rome wanted to decide what the University of Paris would do through his bishop at Paris. And the problems largely stemmed from the fact, because the emphasis was moving away from scholarship to actually propagating religion and religious studies. And therefore, they had this severe problem. So the University of Paris contended with this difficulty for a long time, till 2 popes later, the one who came in saw education differently and gave freedom to the university to decide its education content and delivery, and indeed brought about the first delinking in European universities of religion from education. Because this whole controversy raised this issue of should there be monitoring of higher education. Now this question is still very relevant for us in India. We talk about outcome-based education and all these things, but the basic concerns still remain, and one of the basic concerns is should there be monitoring. Now, we've all accepted that there has to be monitoring. There will be monitoring, because that's the system in which we have grown up. But is it serving a purpose? At least there was one encouraging thought expressed by the Honorable Minister this morning when he said that those who are achievers will be freed from certain kinds of permissions. Permissions. He didn't say monitoring. Certain kinds of permissions with decisions relating to programs and their content. Next question is who should regulate? And there are different possibilities. And once again, you heard in this morning session itself that the first regulator came up in 1987. Of course, there was a regulator before that for the universities, the University Grants Commission, but I'm talking in the context of technical education. The first regulator came up in AICTE. But regulation became a mix of regulation and licensing. So that was a big issue that we contended with. By the way, it still remains. I don't know how many of you recall or are aware that AICTE still gives us permission every year to continue our programs. India must be one of those rare countries where in the name of regulation, permission is given to institutions to continue to offer their programs once a year. I think we need to think about these things and go beyond what we are trying to promote as outcome-based education. And naturally, what should be regulated? There are serious issues. However, that is not the purpose of my talk today, even though I have my own views on these things. So I will move on. Because there are some other present issues which are basically giving us a lot of, shall I say, headache, or a lot of concern, or posing severe challenges to us. And in the context of higher education, I have listed them not in any order of importance, but in the order in which they came to my mind. First, how contemporary is our education? You know, we have such a big pool of talent in this country, but we find that this talent flowers after going abroad and getting some education there. So all the examples that we cite about how they have made innovations in technology and driven technology are people who have got their advanced degrees from MIT, Stanford, Cambridge, and these kinds of institutions. So the talent, how do we preserve it and how do we encourage, how do we grow it? Because there is no dearth of talent in this country, believe me, absolutely no dearth of talent. It's just that it is not looked after the way it should and be allowed to flower. Second is relevance. What do we teach? And we are still using the term teach. We should be changing the focus to what do people learn. But nevertheless, we have to talk about relevance. Because, you know, one of my present assignments as the academic advisor, by the way, it is Ahmedabad, and Ahmedabad University, Ahmedabad Education Society, is to help the colleges which are affiliated to the university there to improve their standards. And, you know, we still see in universities and affiliated colleges examples where people are using 20-year-old notes to conduct classes. And, you know, I still see examples where the faculty hands out notes. So when I talk to them about what kind of innovations they have made in pedagogy and what they teach, they said, I have made beautiful notes. And sometimes these notes are published by second-rate publishers, priced low, and they become the basis of what happens in the classroom. Now this is what is happening in higher education, including, by the way, in technical education. And right outside our university, I now see great boards saying that they offer you tuition classes for MBA. Tuition classes. And what do they tutor you on? With those notes on how to solve, to my mind, irrelevant problems. So relevance is a major issue. Next is employability of graduates. You've all seen surveys. The latest survey that we have seen says that only 22% of our management graduates are employable. Only 22%. I don't know how they worked out that number, frankly speaking, so I can always contest it. But it was on the front page of the Economic Times, the Times of India, and all other publications, where they said 22% of our graduates, according to one of the surveys, reputed body, are actually employable in management. By the way, in engineering, the answer is probably not any different. The responsibility content of jobs is also going on decreasing. What a management graduate today is doing very often is what a glorified clerk would have done earlier. But we give them fancy designations in the organizations they go to. Particularly in the banks, they have this habit. They call them, you know, personal banker. They call them assistant vice president. And many years ago, we used to joke that even the person who was in charge of sanitation was called the assistant vice president sanitation. Placement of graduates is an increasing concern, and the viability of educational institutions themselves is a concern. So many of them are closing down. They don't have the ability to attract faculty, marshal resources, and deliver the kind of education that we need. I've already touched on regulations, so I will not bother. So people have now said the panacea for all of this, we have to now focus on outcome-based education. And so the focus is on outcomes and not inputs. Outcomes, of course, must include knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. Because whenever we want to learn something, we must have three inputs with us. We must know something, we must be able to do something, and we should be able to be somebody in the way we exist. Knowing, doing, being. Some of us attribute this finding to Datar and Garvin when they wrote that book, Management Education at the Crossroads. But actually this thinking is from our scriptures also. To know, to do, and to be. But I want to differ from most speakers on this topic of output-based or outcome-based education. Knowledge generation is also an important outcome in academia. And nobody is talking about it, very unfortunately. We are only thinking that all we have to do is the students have to learn something. Well, they also have to learn how to generate knowledge. They have to acquire the habit of pursuing inquiry. They have to learn to ask questions, why, and seek answers. But we're not talking about that. Societies prosper because of the innovations and the new things that happen. What we invent, what we innovate, and what we experiment with. Otherwise, we cannot prosper. We'll only be borrowing, and we'll only be borrowing, and we'll be importing, and that will be the end of the story, which is what we're trying to do. Of course, it is student-centric, and it rests on the premise of quality assurance. But the need for quality assurance we are all quite aware of, so I'll skip this slide in the interest of time. But one thing we want to remember, this very important pool of talent that we have, whom we are educating in this country, now does not get limited by borders. They are free to move, they are invited to move to other locations, and there is this need for recognition of what they have learned here, the ability to make good with what they have learned here where they go. I mean, there may be all kinds of barriers which people like Trump want to come up with, or the EU wants to come up with now in the context of Brexit and so on. But nevertheless, it is part of the World Trade Organization that there should be free movement of people. And that's going to continue to happen. So, at this point, I'd like to change my gears a little bit and start asking questions. We're talking about outcomes. But before that, we were talking about aims and objectives. So what's the difference? What is the new thing that we are saying? Well, earlier we talked about aims, we talked about objectives, we talked about course objectives, we talked about program objectives, and now we are saying we want to talk about outcomes. And as you heard in the morning, we've actually not achieved very much in being able to define outcomes in the context of higher education and also technical